Hello friends, I welcome you all to another edition of Daily News Analysis. In this particular edition, we are going to discuss some very important articles. The first article is about Afghanistan and earthquake. So in recent times, Afghanistan has been hit by another earthquake. India being the first responder in this case also supported the Afghanistan's people in general in this heavy tragedy. So important analysis from the perspective of GS2 international relations, from the perspective of prelims particularly, knowing the geography and from the perspective of mapping the bordering countries of Afghanistan, again very vital. Another important article that we are going to take a look at is Trump's military action threat in Nigeria. So in recent times we have all seen the Trumpian threats to Nigeria. Again, important analysis from the perspective of GS2 international relations, from the perspective of places in news, mapping this particular news is important. Another important update is about High Seas Treaty. So this particular treaty, after being ratified by almost 60 countries in September itself, will be enforced from the January 26 next year. So essentially important update from the perspective of GS3 environment part particularly. Another important update is about the case for energy efficiency. So India is decarbonizing its energy grid, but on the other hand our particularly the grid efficiency factor, or what we call carbon efficiency of the grid is getting increased. So our grid is emitting more carbon. So this is sort of a contradictory thing. We are actually we are at say 50% when it comes to non renewable energy capacity, but on the other hand our grid factor particularly is increasing. So that is very concerning news from the perspective of energy. GS3 important update in decoded section, that is important from the perspective of means particularly. We are going to take a look at very important and interesting article titled An Indian Way for G2. So essentially G2 here means the geo-economic union of United States and China. So in recent times we have all seen the truce when it comes to trade war between the two countries. To what extent this particular truce will impact India, and what sort of way forward is there when it comes to Indian situation vis-a-vis US as well as China. So important analysis from the perspective of GS2 international relations. Very interesting and important terms and terminologies and basic concept that has been used in this particular article, that are very vital from the perspective of international relations answers. So stay tuned for that particular analysis as well. So the first article is about Afghanistan and earthquake. So with 6.3 magnitude earthquake hitting northern Afghanistan again, India has responded swiftly by reaching out to the Talibani regime. Apart from reaching out to the Taliban itself, India has promised aid as well. Rather, it has sent food and medicine supplies to the Afghani people. So India, being a first responder in any sort of major disasters in its neighborhood, has stood up again. So from the perspective of say international relations, this particular article holds very important and interesting value. Particularly when it comes to India-Afghanistan relations, we have all seen Afghani delegates' recent visit to India. To certain extent, we have re-established our diplomatic relations with Afghanistan under the Taliban regime. Although direct sort of relationship or full diplomatic relationship with the Talibani regime may not be possible, but definitely we have diplomatic channels being open, and we are open to renewed Afghanistan relationship. So from the perspective of say this particular article, we are going to discuss why particularly Afghanistan is so vulnerable to earthquake, and what is there in Afghanistan particularly that it suffers so heavily when it comes to earthquakes. So see, most of the time northern region of Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush region, particularly the Himalayan region, that is there, including the Pamir Knot and Suleiman Range, etc. So all these mountain ranges are poses very important uh, you know challenge when it comes to earthquake management. So disaster management is an issue that has been plaguing Afghanistan since long, because this is all tribal rugged area. So to certain extent the connectivity is an issue. On the other hand the resilience, the infrastructure resilience is very low. Obviously Afghanistan being the underdeveloped country that it is, being plagued by, Islamist terrorism for so long, it is often referred to as the graveyard of empires because of its, rugged terrain and tribal warfare. So essentially, what has happened now, the buildings in Afghanistan are particularly are very, rudimentary in nature. They are not essentially, made to withstand the huge sort of magnitude earthquakes that Afghanistan is sort of experiencing in recent times. So that also, creates more human casualties. So in recent updates also, with recent updates also, on Monday night, we have a 6.3 magnitude earthquake in Afghanistan, particularly in the northern Afghanistan in particular. 20 more than 20 people died in that particular, earthquake, with more than 500 injured. So essentially, US Geological Survey data is there. So it said the quake's epicenter was located 22 kilometers west southwest of the town of Kulm, that is struck at 12:59 a.m. on at a depth of 28 kilometers. So it is a very shallow earthquake. That's why, it has very huge impact when it comes to the overall, building infrastructure in that particular region. So essentially, northern Afghanistan particularly is, very vulnerable to earthquakes. So India's response, as usual, is very swift. Our external affairs minister reached out to, say, the Talibani, counterpart. So to certain extent, and he has assured all sort of support to the Talibani government. Even, our ministry spokesperson called India's role as a first responder. So essentially, he actually gave the hashtag India First Responder. So it is in response to the earthquake in Afghanistan, and India being the first responder to this particular tragedy to help, Afghani people. So to certain extent, the Ministry of External Affairs also reaffirmed India's commitment to the Afghani people. So stating that India has delivered food items or for families affected by the earthquake. Very true. So India is a long-standing partner when it comes to Afghanistan's disaster response. So that's why, India has not only just provided the disaster aid, but it has been a development partner for the Afghanistan as well. It has built many, important infrastructure milestones in the Afghanistan. So essentially, by contributing essential medical supplies, India reaffirms its position as a reliable partner in promoting health, stability and humanitarian cooperation in the overall Afghanistani region. So why Afghanistan is very vulnerable to earthquakes? See, the reason lies in the basic geography of Afghanistan, the location of Afghanistan in particular. See, the Afghanistan sits on the collision zone between the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. Indian plate, you can clearly see in this particular diagram, is pushing against the Eurasian plate, and there is this transgression zone, there is this collision zone that we can clearly see. And the Himalayan mountain is formed due to this particular collision. We all know the basic geography here. So Afghanistan sits on the collision zone between the Indian plate, which is moving northwards towards the Eurasian plate. And due to, this particular collision, we can see that Afghanistan in particular is prone to very, intense earthquakes. So essentially, there are very prominent fault lines in Afghanistan formed due to this particular movement of plates as well. On the south, there is Arabian plate as well. On the south, there is Arabian plate. So essentially, that also is pushing the overall Indian plate northwards, and that also creates much more vulnerability in Afghanistan's rugged regions. See, you can clearly see there are, fault lines being converging near Kabul. So that's why, the area around Kabul is also very vulnerable to uh, earthquakes when it comes to the geography of, say, Afghanistan. So you can clearly see very important sort of fault lines like this particular fault line, and this northern fault line that comes towards, say, the Kabul region in the central area. So essentially, the Hindu Kush region, the Suleiman region in the southeast region, or Suleiman range or in the southeast of the Afghanistan particularly. So the subduction, the transgression zone essentially creates the vulnerability which is the reason for the Afghanistan's vulnerability to overall earthquakes. So, essentially what has happened in recent times also is, although it is vulnerable to the earthquakes, but as I earlier said, the rugged mountains create very important sort of hazard when it comes to lives lost. Why? Because reaching these rugged mountains, and due to the lack of connectivity to these tribal regions, the response becomes very slow. So, from the perspective of say means disaster management also, it creates an issues. So, that's why Afghanistan suffers not just financial loss, but very heavy human lives are lost. Essentially, that's why vulnerability is a vulnerability of Afghanistan to earthquakes is an important aspect of say overall not just geography but also economic development of Afghanistan. So, Afghanistan, as I said, is location, its location wise is on, it sits on the collision zone between Indian plate and Eurasian plate, and that is the basic reason for the vulnerability of Afghanistan to the earthquakes. So, essentially the heavily populated Kabul is also vulnerable because of say the collision or say the convergence of various fault lines in that particular region, in that particular area. So, the lack of particularly overall disaster resilient infrastructure is the reason for the high sort of damage that Afghanistan suffers due to earthquakes. So, from the perspective of mapping, the Afghanistan and its border countries are important. See, India does border Afghanistan. So, very important for you to know that India is the border country of Afghanistan. This particular region, although occupied by Pakistan, often is considered by India as illegally occupied by Pakistan. So, essentially it is called a Wakhan corridor. So, Wakhan corridor means connects India with Afghanistan. So, remember that Afghanistan has border with India theoretically, although currently that particular region has been occupied by Pakistan, and it has been and the China is eyeing that particular region as well, because it has very strategic importance when it comes to say connectivity to wider Central Asia, and apart from that this particular region also holds tremendous mineral wealth as well. So, very important from the perspective of prelims, bordering countries of Afghanistan. UPSC has already asked the question when it comes to bordering countries of Afghanistan. So, as I said, so these are some of the important sort of earthquakes, deadly earthquakes that have happened in recent times in Afghanistan region. So, you can clearly see the area around Kabul and northern Afghanistan in particular is very vulnerable to the intense earthquakes. So, more vulnerable to earthquakes. So, this is very important practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. So, this is also important practice question. So, another important article that we are the next important article that we are going to discuss is about Trump and threat to Nigeria. So, in recent times we have seen that Trump's threat to Nigeria of military action. Why? Because essentially Trump considers Nigeria as violating the rights of its Christian population. So, essentially there are some reports that the Christian population in Nigeria being persecuted by Islamist terrorism, but Islamist terrorism in Nigeria is being felt by the Muslim population which is there as well. So, essentially this particular view of Trump administration has created issues when it comes to bilateral relation between Nigeria and US. So, see, Nigeria is also recipient of say US aid. So, from the perspective of overall bilateral relations and overall relation of Africa with US, this particular threat of Trump to Nigeria is very important. See, essentially the Nigeria has denied that there is Christian persecution or Christian population persecution in Nigeria, or the government there is not doing anything. They said that if the US want to collaborate to tackle Islamist terrorist threat in the region, it is ready, but means Nigeria cannot accept that it is deliberately targeting its own Christian population or it is doing nothing. So, essentially Nigeria in particular is evenly divided between the Christian and say the Muslim populations, see, the threat of Islamist terrorism, particularly Boko Haram, we have all seen, the images of, say, the girls being kidnapped just a few months back or few years back. So essentially, there are very frequent sort of incidences of the girls, women's being kidnapped by these Islamist terrorist gangs. So essentially, the impact of, say, the Islamist terrorism in Nigeria is felt equally by both the populations. So to certain extent, the Trump's assertion here is based on, say, news reports, although it is not 100% false that there is no Christian population persecution in Nigeria, but to certain extent, the reports have been exaggerated as well. So from the perspective of overall, tackling the extremist terroristic threat in Nigeria, we have to look at the problem holistically. So from the perspective of our own understanding of, say, prelims as well as mains, this particular article is important from the perspective of, again, international relations. Apart from that, you may get a question in prelims about, say, the bordering countries of Nigeria. So from the perspective of mapping, this particular point is very, very important. Remember that. So essentially, there is, very important threat of, say, Trump to the territorial sovereignty of Nigeria by Trump, obviously tweeted, or there is a post on Truth Social of Trump that US will go all guns blazing to wipe out the Islamist terrorist responsible for the violence against Christian population in Nigeria. So essentially, what the Trump is saying here is he or the US will intervene in the sovereign country, which otherwise his administration or his promise when he ran for the second administration or second presidency, at that point of time he criticized, Joe Biden's presidency by invoking, say, Afghanistan or involving US in, say, the foreign countries' wars. But now he himself is, involving US in the territorial wars in countries like, say, Venezuela, or his now his threat to, say, Nigeria. So to certain extent, to what extent, Trump will actually go to war or, violate the territorial sovereignty of these countries is questionable, because it may be the case that he may force these countries towards action, some sort of action. Obviously, this particular, Islamist terrorist threat in Nigeria is there. It is prominent issue for the Nigerian population, for the Nigerian people, but earlier it is not used to sort of being highlighted. There are very, very, but again, the issue highlighted by the Trump is of very important value, because it essentially, means the Nigeria essentially has to address this Islamist terrorist threat. And now what Trump has done, he has designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern. So what exactly is the country of particular concern? So there is, International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 in US particularly. Under this particular act, US Department annually reviews each country's, sort of a status. Status on what basis? On religious freedom basis. So essentially, if some countries are found to violate the basic religious freedom of their population, these countries are designated as countries of particular concern under this particular act. So essentially, if any country is designated as country of particular concern under this particular act, they are, say, prone to US sanctions. So US may impose very severe, harsh sanctions. So again, it is a political decision whether to, actually impose the sanctions or not. Earlier also, one or two times or more than that, India used to be under this particular designation under, say, Biden's presidency earlier, or even Obama's presidency before that as well. But the imposition of sanctions is again a political decision. So, but now what has happened is Trump has designated Nigeria as country of particular concern, which makes Nigerian economy vulnerable to US sanctions. Apart from that, Trump has threatened to withdraw US aid support as well. More, Nigeria being the, most populated country in African region, is major recipient of US aid particularly. So essentially, let me give you one data here. A month earlier, the US mission in Nigeria announced that the nation would receive $27 million as a part of $536 million overall humanitarian aid package for sub-Saharan Africa. So essentially, what will be in jeopardy due to this, but due to the imposition of sanction, is aid as well. So this particular threat, to Nigeria will create an economic sort of turbulence overall in the whole region, because see, Nigeria is a powerhouse when it comes, economic powerhouse of overall African continent. Nigeria is also major oil producing countries. It is the biggest oil producing country on the African continent. So one of the largest oil producer is Nigeria's refinery. Nigeria is home to Dangote Petroleum Refinery, which is Africa's largest. So essentially from the overall African energy security also, Nigeria is very important. So what is happening in Nigeria? What is the reason for, say, Trump's outburst against the Nigeria? So Nigeria in particular is facing the Boko Haram and Islamic State of West Africa led emergency. It is essentially it is a radical Islamist terrorist organization which target wrong kind of Muslim, essentially means those who don't follow the strict rule of Sharia. Apart from that, they consider Christians and Shia Muslim population also in violation of, say, this particular strict code of, say, Islamists. These groups are mostly active in the northeast Nigeria, very true. In the northeast region of Nigeria, these groups are very active. So central Nigeria faces conflicts between herder and farmer. See, this particular point here is important. It is not like there is no conflict between the Christian and Muslim population. Particularly in the central Nigerian region, there is the conflict between, say, herder and farmer communities over resources such as pastures, land and water. Normally, the herders are Muslims and the farmers are majorly Christian in the central Nigerian region. So this also creates an issue of, say, religious conflicts in the region, particularly in the central Nigerian region, because it is because of the fight over, say, the resources between the farmers and the herders. So herders are majority Muslims and farmers are majority Christians in that particular region. So that is also, means there may be some issues in the central Nigerian region between, say, say, the Muslim population and Christian population. According to the US based arms conflict location and event data program, between January 2020 and, say, September 2025, there were 11,862 attacks on civilians in Nigeria, causing 20,000 deaths. Of these, 385 attacks were specifically targeted at Christians, resulting in 317 deaths, and while 196 attacks on Muslims caused 417 deaths. So it is sort of both the populations are suffering equally when it comes to this particular terrorist threat. Boko Haram, which was founded in 2002, aims to establish Islamic Caliphate like ISIS and removes corrupting Western influence. So Boko Haram, the meaning of it itself means Western education is haram or forbidden. So that's the meaning of the word Boko Haram, which was established way back in 2002. Remember that. So essentially, Nigeria is one of the largest economies of the African continent and also biggest oil producers. It is home to Dangote Petroleum Refinery, which is Africa's largest. So another important issue or divisions or ethnic divisions which we can find in Nigeria is because of its colonial legacy or colonial past. For example, there is pretty much entrenched inequality. There are communal divisions, as I said, particularly in the central Nigerian region, and an education system that disadvantage northern Nigeria. Inequality remains high today. Even today, it is very high. So northern Nigeria in particular has remained backward because of the lack of proper education or proper health system in that particular area. So Nigeria's colonial past, particularly Nigeria in particular is also a British colony. So essentially, obviously there is a British exploitation which we can prominently see in Nigeria. So essentially, Nigeria got full independence from Britain on October 1, 1960. Just remember these facts. That's it. No need to go too deep into all these things. What can Trump do in Nigeria? What can Trump do in Nigeria now? So while it is difficult to say whether Trump is serious of, say, any sort of direct military action vis-a-vis Nigeria, what he can do is carrying out very targeted strikes within the Nigerian territory on the Islamist hideouts in the northern Nigerian region. So this also has to be, collaborated with the Nigerian army or the Nigerian central government. But another important hurdle when it comes to such territorial attacks or targeted attacks in the northern Nigerian region on the Islamist terrorist hideouts is its lack of base in the region. So in recent times there was American base in the neighboring country Niger, but just last year US withdrew from this particular base. Why? Because the government of Nigeria strongly opposed the presence of, say, American military on its soil. So it is very difficult to say whether US will individually be able to attack these particular terror hideouts in the northern Nigerian region, or whether it can actually seek the cooperation and collaboration with the Nigerian army or the Nigerian government in general. But what is certain is Nigeria is in news. That's why, from the perspective of mapping, you must know its bordering countries. So essentially, Nigeria shares land borders with Benin to the west. Benin you can clearly see, Niger to the north, Chad to the northeast, and Cameroon to the east. So it has maritime boundaries. It is a sort of a very important marine superpower in African continents, with Equatorial Guinea and Sao Tome Principe as its maritime border countries. So essentially very important. Physical features also are very important, like important rivers you can go through, important sort of ports you can go through. So where exactly is the capital located? Abuja, at almost at a central Nigerian region. So very important country from the perspective of mapping. This is very important practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. So another important news is about High Seas Treaty. So in the month of September particularly, the 60 countries, that is the threshold of, say, enforcement of this particular treaty has been reached. So essentially 60 countries have ratified this particular treaty, and this particular treaty will be operational from the January 26 next year. So important update from the perspective of GS3 environment particularly. We have already covered so many times this particular High Seas Treaty in our earlier DNA episodes as well. So what exactly is this High Seas Treaty? It is the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. Very important treaty that has been signed by India as well. Although India has signed it, it is yet to ratify it. Remember that India has not ratified this particular treaty, but in the upcoming months we will see India being ratifying this particular treaty, because the process is in motion, because India has to actually amend many environmental laws to actually align itself with the principles that are outlined in this particular High Seas Treaty. So essentially the threshold has been reached, 60 countries, and we will see the implementation from January 2026 of this particular treaty. So the treaty sets rule to preserve and use marine biodiversity sustainably and efficiently and to address also the threats from, say, climate change or overfishing or pollution. So we are going to see whether we are going to protect the high seas. So high seas, the waters beyond the jurisdiction of any countries. So essentially earlier what used to happen, this particular region of the oceans is not governed by any sort of specific treaties. The UN Close Treaty of 1982 in particular have very huge gaps that were not addressed properly over the period of time, and many countries sort of misused this particular gaps in this particular in the treaty, because high seas are considered open ground for the powerful countries to explore or sort of do the freedom of navigation sort of exercises in the high seas. So but again, what the agreement now does is it will protect, say, the biodiversity in the high seas. Particularly, we will have marine protected areas, we will have, environmental impact assessment in these regions, which were not possible under earlier UN clause. So that is one of the gap that we can find in UN clause of 1982. Particularly, the High Seas Treaty is formally called Agreement on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, BBNJ. It was signed in 2023, remember that, in New York, particularly on 20th September. Obviously, it applies to areas beyond the national jurisdiction of the each country, beyond the EEZ, essentially, which makes up nearly 2/3 of the world's oceans. Very true. So, high seas, beyond EEZ, exclusive economic zones, we have high seas. So, beyond 200 nautical miles, it is called the high sea. Remember that, just remember that. So, main provisions of, say, this particular BBNJ treaty, we have already covered it many times. See, the creation of marine protected area is one in the high seas, particularly monitor, assess and manage human activities affecting marine biodiversity in the region, framework for sharing benefits from the use of marine genetic resources. This also is very, very important, marine genetic resources, MGRs. Earlier, another important protocol that addresses the equal or, equitable benefit sharing of genetic resources, particularly is Nagoya Protocol, remember that. So, Nagoya is also associated with the equitable benefit sharing of genetic resources, strengthening international cooperation and capacity building for the developing countries. So, very, very important article, particularly very, very important treaty that has been signed for the protection of high seas. So, you can clearly see the exclusive economic zones until 200 nautical miles, 200 nautical miles in particular, 370 kilometer from the baseline. Baseline you can see here, baseline is, say, the internal waters, essentially from the land border until 200 nautical miles or 370 kilometer, we have this exclusive economic zones. So, essentially beyond that we can see there are high seas. So, high seas, almost 64 or 65% of the world's oceans are occupied by high seas. 45% of Earth's surface is also occupied by high seas. 1.2% of it is just protected. So, it is unprotected region. Now, to certain extent, through the creation of marine protected areas, we are able to protect the high biodiversity rich high seas. The so that's why this particular treaty, this particular agreement is very, very important. So, it recognizes marine genetic resources as the common heritage of humankind and emphasizes the fair and equitable sharing of this particular resource. As I said, Nagoya Protocol also addresses this particular issue. We all know that. The treaty introduces area-based management tools, ABMTs, including marine protected areas. So, area-based management tools are not part of UN clause. Earlier, UN clause does not address these particular issues. There are, under the UN clause treaty, we cannot have marine protected areas because there are no provisions for area-based, management tools. So, essentially what will happen now, we can create, marine protected areas, and in those marine protected areas, there will be restrictions on, say, fishing, on, say, freedom of navigation, etc., etc. These measures aim to, improve the climate resilience and ensure food security is not affected. The agreement also mandates environmental impact assessment for activities that may affect these areas, particularly the high seas. So, essentially this also is not addressed by UN clause. So, essentially this particular treaty has filled the gaps that are present in the UN clause treaty. By 2011, states agreed to negotiate on 4 key issues like these: MGRs, ABMTs and EIAs, capacity building and technology transfer. So, these particular issues, these 4 issues were not addressed sufficiently by 1982 agreement of UN clause particularly, and those issues were addressed now under the High Seas Treaty. So, this is the points here are about, say, the evolution of this particular treaty. So between 2018 and 2023, the intergovernmental conference sessions were held. The parties reached an agreement in 2023 itself, actually. So very important. See, proposed marine protected areas, marine protection areas under the Act are very important. Emperor Seamount Chain, Costa Rica Dome, or Salsi Y Gomez and Nazca Ridges, the Lost City, Sargasso Sea and Corner Rise, Gulf of Guinea, Walvis Ridge, Arabian Sea, Mascarene Plateau, and Lord Howe Rise and Tasman Sea. So these are some of the important marine protected areas, say the that will be established under this particular high seas treaty. So remember these particular regions very important from the perspective of say places in news. You may get a direct question uh, uh, on it in the prelims exam. So remember that. So but considering the success of this particular treaty, what are the major issues? See, majorly the issue is of say the major non-signees of this particular treaty. See, many times the US, China and Russia, all these major powers have actually issues with this particular treaty, and the current Trump administration, although US under earlier Biden administration did sign the treaty, under the current Trump administration we have no hope that it will be ratified. Neither Russia nor China has ratified this particular treaty as well. So the absence of these particular important nation is an issue. The first challenge is also use of MGRs, marine genetic resources, creating ambiguity in exploration, research and benefit sharing. There is no still the establishment is good thing. We are talking about equitable sharing, but there is no actual formula that has been given in this particular treaty. So there is an ambiguity on the use of MGRs as well. Another important issue is treaty must navigate interaction with existing multilateral institutions as well. So there will be conflict issues, territorial conflict issues due to say the imposition of this particular treaty. There may be cross border issues as well. It must coexist with other organizations like International Seabed Authority or regional fisheries management offices. So essentially the jurisdictional issues will also be major problem going forward. So but essentially there is a need of dynamic management of MPAs and regular monitoring so that these marine protected areas are preserved. To deliver the BBNJ, linking climate biodiversity with ocean will be crucial for resilient management overall. So very important treaty from the perspective of overall protection of our high seas and the marine biodiversity that is present there. It will address the gaps that are present in the earlier UN closed treaty through the establishment of say marine protected areas or even environmental impact assessment. So essentially very important treaty from the perspective of exam in prelims as well as mains. So this is very important practice question. Just comment your answer in the comment section. So another important article is about the case for energy efficiency. See, most of the time India is marching towards decarbonizing our electricity grid, but another important thing to understand is it has doubled down on say the clean energy. Currently we have almost 50% renewable energy capacity, particularly non-fossil fuel renewable energy capacity is at 50% of the total energy capacity, electricity capacity. But on the other hand, our grid emission factor, GEF, grid emission factor, it is the carbon intensity of electricity. So essentially how much greenhouse gas, for example CO2, is emitted while producing 1 unit of electricity in the grid, 1 unit megawatt hour of unit. Okay, 1 megawatt hour of unit, to produce 1 megawatt hour of unit, how much greenhouse gas emission, particularly the CO2 is emitted by the grid, is measured by this particular factor. So GEF. So the lesser the GEF, it is better because it shows that we are producing the energy in a more green way, because each sort of reduction, each unit of reduction in GEF, there is sort of we are moving towards greening our grid, because the lesser and lesser amount of CO2 is being greenhouse gases are being emitted in the production or production of this unit of electricity. So, but what has happened with India's grid emission factor is it has increased according to Central Electricity Authority. See, it has increased from 0.703 trillions of CO2 per megawatt hour in 2020-21 to 0.727 TCO2 per megawatt hour. So, essentially it is sort of divergence or dilemma here. So, it is sort of a paradox. Why it is a paradox is because on the one hand we are actually talking about greening our grid. We are actually talking about, say, almost 50% of our overall energy capacities of non-fossil fuel energy. On the other hand, our grid emission factor is getting increased. It is a striking reversal. More renewable should mean a cleaner grid. Why is India's grid getting dirtier instead? So, that is the very important and a very practical question that has been asked in this particular article. So, obviously there is a capacity generation mismatch. Very true. See, we have the capacity, almost 50% of our capacity is renewable energy, but how much is actually produced by the renewable energy? It is 15 to 25% of, say, the capacity utilization. So, essentially the efficiency factor when it comes to renewable energy is less. See, most of the time we all know the energy efficiency of, say, one solar panel or one solar cell. So, it hasn't reached 1/3. So, not on average it is about 15 to 20% most of the time. So, what it shows is there is, when it comes to renewable energy, although we have the capacity, 50% capacity occupied, but only the efficiency, the capacity utilization is 15 to 20%. On the other hand, when it comes to coal and nuclear, 65 to 90% is the capacity utilization. So, essentially that is sort of a capacity and generation mismatch. So, in 23-24 particularly, this particular data is also very indicative here. Renewables including hydro supplied only 22% of total electricity. Although we are talking about, say, capacity, means 50% capacity, but only 22% electricity is given by the renewables in 23-24, which also includes, by the way, hydro, with remainder generated by fossil fuels, primarily coal. So, still almost 78% of our electricity demand has been fulfilled by the fossil fuels, particularly primarily coal. So, essentially India's electricity demand peaks when renewable energy output is very low. See, most of the time in night we have high sort of grid load, but in night we cannot have the sunlight. But on the other hand, demand peaks when renewable output is low. It is very true. In the afternoon when the sun is overhead, the demand is bit low, but in the evening when there is demand is high, we need efficient batteries to preserve this particular solar energy. So, fossil fuel plants act as a shock absorber. So, there is an issue of intermittency. So, fossil fuels in particularly act as a shock absorber to actually fulfill or fill up this particular capacity generation mismatch associated with the renewable energy. So, round the clock renewable electricity costing less than rupees 5 per kilowatt hour is cheaper than new coal plants, but scaling it remains low. So, what do you mean by round the clock? What is mean by round the clock renewable energy? Round the clock renewable energy means continuous renewable energy. See, if there is it is a combination of solar energy, wind energy and batteries. So, essentially there is no intermittency in round the clock renewable energy. So, round the clock renewable energy will provide efficient and continuous supply of electricity, but again the scaling up these sort of projects is very low, because it is the combination of solar, wind, and to certain extent we need efficient batteries to actually store these particular intermittent energy sources. So, from the perspective of, say, scaling of these projects, we need to focus on round the clock renewable energy projects, but to certain extent means to accelerate this particular renewable adoption, policies must enable access to more land transmission infrastructure and investment. So, to have more RTC projects, we need to focus on more land transmission infrastructure and investment in these sort of projects. So, not just standalone projects, we need to combine solar, wind or with battery sort of infrastructure. So, the role of energy efficiency, the article suggests that focus more on energy efficiency. It can be your first fuel which will reduce electricity demand before supply is even generated. So, focus on energy efficiency, that is what article argues, because scaling up RTC projects means particularly renewable RTC projects will take time, but before that what you can do is you can focus on energy efficiency. Scaling up efficient appliances, fans, air conditioners, motors and embedding efficiency in buildings and industrial processes can reshape overall demand patterns. It also prevents lock-in by replacing old efficient technologies early. Very true. Particularly data from India's Bureau of Energy Efficiency shows that this particular data is very, very indicative here. Fiscal year 2017-18 to fiscal year 22-23, energy efficiency measures saved almost 200 million tons of oil equivalent to 1.29 gigatons of CO2 emissions and nearly 7,60,000 crore in cost savings. So, this is very, very indicative and very, very important data. Note it down. So, essentially energy efficiency measures actually saved tremendous amount of money in just 6 years. India's pathway is very unique to countries like very unique when it compares to countries like France, Norway or Sweden, where grid factor is 0.1 to 0.2. So, essentially they emit less amount of say CO2. So, we cannot compare to these countries, but why these countries are say means have these efficient grid factors, grid emission factors in particular, because they have large shares of hydro and nuclear in it. So, essentially, but when it comes to India's own sort of production, grid electricity, it is majority coal still. So, that is why means it is very high when it comes to grid electricity factor ratio. India starts from coal heavy base and faces rapid demand growth, making energy efficiency a core strategy rather than optional measure. Very true. So, focus more on the energy efficiency. So, focus on energy efficiency will have better impact when compared to say upscaling or establishing new RTC projects, renewable energy projects. So, essentially these are some of the solutions that has been given. So, you can clearly see electricity services like green cooling, enabling high efficiency air conditioning powered by round the clock clean energy, scrappage incentives, flexible pricing, efficient motors and pumps, industrial processes, batteries into virtual power plants to help the grid manage peak demand, appliance efficiency standards need acceleration as well. These are some of the important sort of solutions that has been given in the article. Just note down 2 or 3 you can effectively utilize in your answers particularly. So, essentially India has grown its economy while reducing emissions intensity by 33% between 2005 and 2019. So, we have achieved this particular Paris goal target. However, rising GEF, grid emission factor, highlights the need for balanced strategy. Balancing what? Accelerate supply side investment in renewable storage and transmission while embedding efficiency across households, industries and cities. To truly decarbonize the grid, efficiency must be the first fuel. So, efficiency should be the first fuel and flexibility, not fossil fuels, must drive the future. So, this is the conclusion of this particular article. Just this is very interesting and important practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. So, in decoded section, we are going to take a look at very important articles from the perspective of international relations. So, it is titled An India Way for G2. So, G2 here means the geo-economic combination between US and China. So, it seems like there is the revival of the concept called G2. Even Trump administration, the Trump himself tweeted about it. The G2 will be convening shortly. So, G2 is not a geopolitical concept, remember that. It is geo-economic concept in which US and China are considered the two poles of overall world economy, and these two countries when collaborate or cooperate, they will anchor the overall world economy. So that's the basic idea behind G2. So essentially it is the caucus of two that could together work to ensure sustained recovery of the global economy. So it is considered as the caucus of the two. Caucus of the two. Who are these caucuses? Essentially US and China. It was not a geopolitical concept, it is a geo-economic one, remember that. It has been given by the American economist Fred Bergsten. Remember these particular names, very vital. You can utilize such names effectively in your answer. Fred Bergsten published a book. What is the name of the book? The United States and the World Economy, in which he proposed the idea of US and China being the two caucuses, essentially that could together work to ensure sustained recovery of the global economy, and these two countries he called G2. So although in later times he went on to suggest that G2 could substitute for the G20 and insisted that he did not think that G2 should be viewed as managing the world economy, but rather as a cooperating to ensure speedy global economic recovery. Although in later times he said that G2 is not replacing G20, it is cooperating. These two world economies are cooperating to ensure speedy global economic recovery. Speedy global economic recovery, particularly also post Atlantic, transatlantic financial crisis of 2008-9, global financial crisis of 2008 particularly, gave the momentum to this particular idea. Why? Because essentially the traditional transatlantic economic consensus broke down after the global financial crisis. The crisis caused the shrinking of transatlantic economies, particularly the US, Britain, Germany, Italy and France, while China's share of world economy and trade increased at that point of time. More importantly, China played a very important critical role at that point of time. It essentially rescued the world economy, including the US and EU, similar to earlier support for Thailand and Indonesia after the 1998 Asian financial crisis. According to, there is very famous statement of US Treasury Secretary at that point of time, which said China aided global and American recovery through massive fiscal stimulus, protecting the US dollar in which it had heavily invested and sustaining the world trade during the post-crisis years. So particularly, China has the highest amount of forex reserve and majority of it is, say, in the US dollars. So that's why, and the massive fiscal stimulus that it gave to its own economy sort of jolted all other currencies like US dollar or EU also means positively. So it actually boosted the American recovery post the global financial crisis. So it turned out to be a turning point, accelerating Chinese rise and highlighting the interconnectedness of the US and Chinese economy. See, it is very vital. Even Trump administration is, say, trying geo-economic containment of China, but to certain extent whether it will be successful or not is very questionable. See, there is an issue of, say, delinking the US and Chinese economies. Earlier, what Joe Biden administration tried is de-risking the US economy from, say, Chinese. So particularly to reduce the dependence on China. So that's the focus of, say, Joe Biden administration. Although the current Trump administration is also trying to de-link US and Chinese economies, but the current trade war truce that we have just seen between the US and China has shown that the economic bullying of China will not work. So to certain extent there are in some quarter it is considered as a win for China in the trade war with US. So the revival of the G2 idea itself stands in strong contrast to Trump's disinterest in the G20. Trump in particular hasn't shown that much of an interest in G20. See, there is tradition, it is considered that Trump hates very huge sort of means unwieldy group of countries or gatherings. So that's why because he considers that less number of countries, more it is means efficient to manage the conflicts effectively, or to reach the deal. If the less number of countries are involved, it is very easier to deal because there will be less ego to satisfy. So that's the basic thinking behind the Trump administration's disdain for such large sort of global organizations. So that's why he actually did not attend the APEC summit in recent times as well. So, particularly what has happened now, uh, the strategy seems to have run its course when it comes to trade war of Trump administration. Allies like European Union and Japan fell in line, very important, but Brazil, China and India have stood their ground as well. So, Brazil, China and India have stood their ground. They they have said that they will not be bullied easily. So, to certain extent, the current trade truce between US and China is considered a win for China. But what can be the India's approach? See, there is very famous in the India way strategies for an uncertain world. This is the book written by our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar. What he said in that particular book is very, very interesting and very, very important. Just note down verbatim. India's policy of multi-alignment would require it to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood and expand traditional constituencies of support. So, this is the policy that is driving the current Indian diplomacy, the Indian foreign policy. So, as I said, just use it verbatim in your answers. So, you can effectively write good answers in international relations if you use such type of terms and terminologies. So, it would be fair to say today that thanks to Trump, India is now required to in fact manage America and engage China while continuing to reassure Russia. So, we cannot forget Russia. We have to reassure Russia that we are still its strategic partner. A quarter century ago, engaging America was seen as a way to manage China, but today the dynamic has shifted. Essentially, to engage US, we have to manage China. So, China appears to be a way to manage America, creating new strategic considerations for New Delhi and giving Beijing additional leverage in the process. So, very true. Currently Chinese government have all the cards. Why? Because obviously the Chinese government has utilized its strategic importance, say when it comes to rare earth elements or say rare earth magnets for that matter, and overall managing the relations of its own relations with US effectively. The Modi government has so far adopted well to this new environment, refusing to kowtow to US president's pressure, showing patience in managing him. Any future return to traditional engagement will depend on the success of these management efforts. And other key interlocutors also include particularly its Asian neighbors. Indian strategists and security analysts recognize that in near term, India's global standing will heavily depend on its position within Asia. So, whether it will be able to engage or manage China effectively or not will decide its overall position in the global order. Previously, New Delhi believed that a strong relationship with Washington would improve its equations globally in Europe, Eurasia and Asia, a perspective that guided Manmohan Singh's outreach to George Bush at that point of time. That is sort of a traditional consensus, but we are in fact in a situation wherein a better relationship across Asia will stand in India in good stead in dealing with the West, both US and Europe. So, the equation has reserved now. The better relations within Asia itself will actually guide our own relation with US and Europe now. Particularly the Jaishankar statement again is very, very vital here. Change has a life of its own and the world will inevitably respond to new circumstances. Adjustments will be made, calculations will come into play, fresh understandings will be forged, new opportunities will emerge and resilient solutions will be devised. So, clearly this is the Indian way forward when it comes to G2 geo-economic dilemma. So, this is very interesting and important practice question for you. That's it from my side and stay tuned for another edition of Daily News Analysis. Thank you.